Well, we're studying the fruit of the Spirit right now, and a study of the fruit of the Spirit is really a study of the life of Jesus, because each characteristic fruit describes what Jesus is like, and Jesus epitomizes each characteristic to the ultimate degree. So if the first fruit of the Spirit is love, which is that way because Jesus is love, and not only is he love, but he is the ultimate expression of love. And if the fruit is joy, then Jesus is the most joyful person who ever lived. And the same with peace. He is the most peaceful person who's ever lived. And likewise with patience, which is what we're looking at today. Jesus is the most patient person who ever lived. And he wants that patience to flow through our lives. If you may recall, I mentioned this briefly in one of the messages recently, that when Jesus stood at one of the great feasts, he declared himself to be living water. And he said, if you drink from this water, out of your innermost being will flow rivers of living water. And then John, commentating on that, said that this he spoke of the Spirit who had not yet been given, meaning that when we take Christ into our lives, when we drink of that living water, his Spirit will flow through our lives. And so when we're thinking of the fruit of the Spirit, that's describing these characteristics of Jesus that are to flow through our lives. He wants his love, his joy, his peace, his patience, and so on to flow through our lives. And that's good news, because I would think probably there's a lot of us that would confess to maybe not being very patient. But Jesus doesn't really want you to be patient. What he wants is for you to allow him, who is the ultimate expression of patience, to manifest himself through you in your relationships. When we look at the life of Jesus, it's clear to see his patience on so many different fronts and different people that he encountered in his ministry. For example, he was trying to prepare his disciples for what would happen when he was arrested, and just helping them to get in a mental space where they would be ready to deal with that. And he warned them that they would flee when things got tough. They were going to scatter, but Peter argued with him and said, there's no way that's going to happen. I am so dedicated to you. Even if I have to lay down my life and sacrifice, I'm never going to abandon you. I'm going to stay with you. And Jesus spoke to Peter and said, Peter, you are going to abandon me, but when you come back, I need you to strengthen your brothers, because they're going to abandon me too. And Peter kept arguing with him and said, no, Lord, I will lay down my life for you. And in Luke 22:32, Jesus said, but I have pleaded in prayer for you, Simon, which is also his name, Simon Peter. I prayed for you, Simon, that your faith should not fail. So when you have repented and returned to me again, strengthen your brothers. Peter said, Lord, I am ready to go to prison with you and even to die with you. But Jesus said, Peter, let me tell you something. Before the rooster crows tomorrow morning, you will deny 3 times that you even know me. And so he knows that Peter is going to mess up, and yet he wants to use Peter. He wants Peter to strengthen the others when they too come back. And so Peter does deny the Lord. And after he denies the Lord and runs away, after Jesus is crucified and buried, after Jesus rises from the dead and Peter is still away, he's brokenhearted, he's disillusioned, he's embarrassed, he's far from the Lord. And it would have been so easy for Jesus to just simply drop Peter at that point, because Peter rejected Jesus. And it wasn't just because he was afraid of the little village girl, as you know the story, and didn't want to admit that he was one of Jesus' followers, but he outright rejected Jesus because Jesus wasn't the kind of Messiah he thought Jesus was. He wanted a Messiah who would come and defeat the Roman government. And when he realized that's not what Jesus came to do, he walked away. And I think, had I or maybe one of you had been over that group, we might have walked away from Peter. You rejected me, that's fine. Then I'll just go find another disciple. I don't really need you. I can build this with someone else. But that's not what Jesus did. He gave his angel instructions to specifically seek Peter out. When the women came to the tomb the morning of Jesus' resurrection, they met an angel. And it's so telling what the angel said. In Mark 16:7, the angel says, now go and tell his disciples, including Peter. One of the versions says, go and tell his disciples, especially Peter that Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee, and you will see him there. And so despite Peter's pride and despite Peter's rejection of him, Jesus in all patience is still willing to work with him in reaching out to him. On another occasion, Jesus fed 5,000 men plus women and children. And as you read the story, I think he's playing with his disciples a little bit because it's getting late. They need to go disperse the crowd because they're way out in the wilderness. And they need to go find something to eat, and there are no stores or markets, or there's nothing around there for them to eat or even have lodging. And Jesus turns to his disciples and says, these people need to eat. And the disciples are concerned about how that's going to happen. And Jesus said, well, you feed them. And if you know the story, they had a couple of fish and a couple of loaves of bread, and miraculously Jesus divided the bread and the fish and was able to feed all 5,000 men plus women and children. And then they collected what was left over. And when they collected what was left over, they had 12 baskets full of fish and bread left over when they just started with a couple. And I'm sure Jesus took each basket and gave one to each of the 12 disciples. It's not coincidental that there were 12 left over as a lesson, because they thought, we're never going to be able to feed all of these people. In fact, they said it, with just a few loaves of bread and fish, how are we going to feed all of these thousands of people? So it was a lesson they needed to learn. It wasn't too much later than that there was another gathering, and this time with about 4,000. And Jesus asked the very same question. These people need something to eat. What are we going to do? And the disciples again entered into this doubt mode. Lord, we can't feed them. There's just too many. And so Jesus did the whole thing again. And he fed them all, and they collected the baskets, and this time there were 7 baskets of food left over. You would think maybe they're getting the point, or you would hope they would get the point after this. But then they get into a boat, and they're starting across the sea. And Jesus made a statement to them. He said, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. And they started talking amongst themselves, and they thought, leaven, he's talking about bread. And they realized, oh, we didn't bring any bread with us. We're not going to have any food to eat. And they started to panic and thought the Lord was going to be upset with them because they didn't have food. He wasn't even talking about bread. He was talking about the leaven of the Pharisees, about what they would do. But then Jesus makes this statement, and he's frustrated. Now, I will say this, that frustration does not mean necessarily impatience. And I'll show you that in a moment. But he's frustrated. In Mark 8:14, it says, but the disciples had forgotten to bring any food. They had only 1 loaf of bread with them in the boat. And as they were crossing the lake, Jesus warned them, watch out, beware the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod. At this, they began to argue with each other because they hadn't brought any bread. Jesus knew what they were saying, so he said, why are you arguing about having no bread? Don't you know or understand even yet? Are your hearts too hard to take it in? You have eyes, can't you see? You have ears, can't you hear? Don't you remember anything at all? When I fed the 5,000 with 5 loaves of bread, how many baskets of leftovers did you pick up afterwards? And you can just see them tucking their tails between their legs and bowing their heads. 12, they said. And when I fed the 4,000 with 7 loaves, how many baskets of leftovers did you pick up? 7, they said. Don't you understand yet? He asked them. So there's this frustration. They are not getting it. And yet, even so, Jesus patiently takes them to a place called Caesarea Philippi and continues to work with them. And this is where he asks that famous question, who do men say that I am? Some say you're, John the Baptist come back from the dead. Some say you're Moses. Some say you're Elijah. But who do you say that I am? And Peter answers, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus commends him. Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood hasn't revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And you are Peter, but I shall call you Rock, for on this rock I will build my church. And so there's this incredible commissioning, helping them in their understanding of who he is, in spite of the fact that they're slow of learning, they're not getting it, but he patiently works with them, continues to work with them, and even understands that in their dullness, God is going to build a church on the confession of faith that Peter has just voiced. On another occasion, the disciples are trying to cast a demon out of a little boy. A father brings his son to them. Jesus is up on the mountain with 3 of his disciples, and they're trying as hard as they can to cast this demon out, and they can't do it. Finally, Jesus comes down from the mountain. The father comes over to him and says, your disciples have tried. They can't cast the demon out. He's frustrated because he's not getting the results he wants. And so Jesus calls the the Father to bring the Son to him. And Jesus in Mark 9:19 says to them, "You faithless people, how long must I be with you? How long must I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." And he cast the demon out. So there's a frustration there. But then Jesus takes his disciples privately and gives them instruction. They want to know, why couldn't we cast it out? And instead of him being angry with them, he's frustrated, but he teaches them and helps them to understand that this kind comes out but by prayer and fasting. And if you have faith, even as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, be cast into the ocean, and it'll be cast into the sea. And so over and over again, in spite of frustration, Jesus keeps working with them. He is the most patient person. He wants that same patience to be operating in and through our lives. But the fruit of the Spirit, Galatians 5:22 says, but the fruit of the Spirit is patience. Now that word, there's actually a couple of different Greek words that are translated as the English word patience. But here in this verse, the fruit of the Spirit is patience. The word that's used there is makrothumia. And it's kind of made from two words put together. Macro, you're familiar with that term. We use it in our language today. But macro means long, or it means big. And then the word thumos, we have the word thermos or thermostat. We use those words that come from that Greek word, but it means temper. And so when you put the two together, macros and thumos, it means long-tempered. The opposite of that would be short-tempered or short-fused. So really, impatience isn't about frustration. Impatience is about losing your temper. It's about being short-fused. You become frustrated, and there's a tipping point where you lose it. And it's at that moment when you lose it that you are impatient. And so a person who has a short fuse is not allowing the patience of Jesus to flow through their lives. And look, we've all been there at times. You know what I mean. When I moved to North Carolina, my patience was tested greatly from driving. Because if you've ever been in the South or driven in the South, you know that when the light turns green, it doesn't mean go. It means just kind of think about it or think about something else. And I've had times when I've sat at the light and literally it's turned green and then it turned yellow and red again because that person was doing something and talking to somebody else. And there would be times that the sweat would just start running down my forehead, and I would honk my horn, and I would just get so upset because they just would not go when they needed to go. Sometimes our impatience gets the best of us, and it leads us to all kinds of trouble. Marcia and I had just built a home in Maine, and it was kind of our dream home. We had designed it. We bought some property out in the woods, and I cleared the property myself. And so we cleared the trees. We built it all up. We had it built. It was a stick-built home. We put these beautiful hardwood floors in the home, and I thought we were going to be there forever. It didn't work out that way, but that's what I thought was going to happen. And I remember we were moving furniture in, and I was alone, and I wanted to get the furniture up into the living room and get it set. It was down in the basement, and I was instructed, wait till you can get help and somebody can come. But no, I wasn't going to do that. I wanted to get that in now. I didn't want to wait for somebody. And I had this big couch that I wanted to get upstairs, and I thought I can use leverage, and I can figure out ways. I will get that thing up. It's the stairway that was turned and around, but I am going to do this. And so I worked hard and tried to bend that thing so it wouldn't knock a wall or anything. And I finally got it all the way up to the landing in the living room. I thought, there, I got that done. I knew I could do this, and now it's a big fluffy couch. I'm just going to turn it upside down on its fluffy part, and I'll slide it across that beautiful hardwood floor, and I will put that thing in place. And so I slide that all the way across the floor, not realizing that when I'm doing that, there's a staple right underneath some of that cushion, and all the way up the entire floor, there's this giant scratch that goes through the entire main floor of the house. So these brand new floors we just got in, and I was so angry. I dropped to my knees and I screamed, and I won't repeat to you what I screamed, but I screamed. I was so angry at what I had done because I was impatient. I wanted that furniture there then. Maybe you've been that way before. We run ahead of God, and we get into all kinds of trouble. That's what happened to Moses. He ran ahead of God when Israel was needing water, and God said to him, I want you to strike the rock. And he struck the rock, and water gushed out of it. Many years later, they're in another similar situation. They are without water, and they come to Moses and they complain, and instead of him hearing from God, he says, shall I provide water for you all the time? And he strikes the rock again, and God didn't want him to strike the rock. God wanted him to speak to the rock, because God was setting up a typology, and so because of that, he was withheld from going into the promised land. He got ahead of God in his impatience. It got him into all kinds of trouble. Now, getting angry, I need to say this, getting angry and losing your temper are not the same thing. Getting frustrated and being impatient are not the same thing. You can get angry and not lose your temper. And in fact, in Ephesians 4:26, it says, be angry and yet do not sin. So it's possible to be angry and not sin, but anger can lead to sin. The apostle goes on to tell us how it does. In verse 26, it says, do not let the sun go down on your anger. In other words, when we hold on to that anger and the sun goes down, we don't let go. It develops into a grudge, and it opens up the opportunity for the enemy to attack our lives, because he goes on in verse 27 and says, and do not give the devil an opportunity. We give him a foothold to gain entrance into our lives when we hang on to our anger. Chuck Swindoll, in a book he wrote titled Anger, lays out different levels of anger, and you can see from those different levels where sin enters in. The first two levels, you can experience those and not be guilty of sinning. And I think I have these in your notes. The first one is irritation. You know, a feeling of discomfort brought about by someone or something. Could be frustration, could fit in there as well. The next one goes to indignation, which is a feeling that something must be answered. There must be a correcting of that which is wrong. We can experience anger in those forms without entering into sin, but the next few levels are problematic. He talks about wrath, which is giving expression to a strong desire to revenge, then fury, which is the loss of emotional control, and then finally rage, a temporary loss of control involving acts of violence, and so the angry person scarcely realizes what he has done. Impatience, this losing our temper, it damages relationships. It leads to all kinds of problems, and you know that. Proverbs 15:18 says, a hot-tempered person starts fights. A cool-tempered person stops them. Proverbs 19:11, sensible people control their temper. They earn respect by overlooking wrongs. But a person who's hot-tempered, they don't overlook wrongs. They hang on to them and they capitalize on them, and it creates division in relationships. So Jesus wants to fill us with his patience, but impatience blocks that from flowing through our lives. And so the question is, how do we deal with impatience? How do we deal with a short fuse so that the patience of Jesus can flow through our lives? And before I kind of tell you what we do need to do, let me share with you two things we do not do, two ways we do not try to become more patient. And one of those is to pray for patience. You do not become more patient by praying for patience. And maybe not for the reason people think. A lot of people say, man, don't pray for patience. You pray for patience, all kinds of bad stuff is going to happen in your life. And then you're going to have, that's because like God's going to throw you in the deep end of the pool and just kind of say swim. But that's not how God works. I would say, do not pray for patience as a solution to your impatience for this reason, because it does not work. That's not the problem. In fact, because you have Jesus in you, you already have the patience of God in you. You have the Spirit in you. The patience of Jesus is already in us. The problem is it isn't flowing out of us because there's something blocking it from being expressed. So we have to find out what that is and deal with that. Here's another thing we do not do. When we have an impatience problem, we do not deal with our anger. Anger management. We don't attack the anger and try to deal with that. Now, don't misunderstand me. If a person has an anger problem, anger management and dealing with anger, those are good ideas. But it isn't going to help if your anger is due to an impatience problem, because anger is not the cause of the impatience. Anger is the symptom of the impatience. So what do? How do we deal with impatience? Well, if we're going to deal with it, I think we have to recognize the root causes of our impatience. Why am I impatient? What's driving that. Because if I can deal with those, then I can remove those things out of the way so that the patience of Jesus can flow through my life or flow through your life. And so I want to share with you two common root causes of impatience in our lives, why we blow our fuse, why we let go. Number one is a lack of trust. God is in control of our lives. God is in control of our schedules. But when we have a lack of trust, we don't really trust that He is, it's easy to blow a fuse. Psalm 31:15 says, "My future is in your hands." Or one version says, "Our times are in your hands." Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that God causes everything to work together for the good to those who love God and are called according to His purpose for them." But the question is, do we really believe that our times are in His hands? Do we really believe that God is sovereign, that God is in control? Do we really believe that God will get us where He wants us, when He wants us? Our impatience betrays the fact that we really don't believe that. And so our issue is a problem of trust. And there are many stories in the Bible of those who had a difficult time trusting God, and so they leapt ahead of Him. You know the story of Abraham and Sarai, how they could not have children, and so they decided that God had promised a child and it wasn't happening, and so it was suggested by Sarai that Abraham lie with her servant Hagar, and he could produce a child through Hagar instead of through her. And so Abraham leapt ahead of God's plan, and Ishmael was born. And out of Ishmael came the whole conflict between the Israelites and the Arab people today. Those are the two streams that come from Ishmael and Isaac, who was the promised child who was eventually born. And they've been fighting ever since. That's been 4,000 years now. Eventually, God's plan was for this 100-year-old man and this 90-year-old woman to get pregnant and have a baby whom they would name Isaac. And it would be such an incredible miracle that it was obvious it was something God did and not something that they had done. But Abraham got ahead, and it caused all kinds of problems in his immediate family, and it's caused problems in the world ever since. Or we think about Saul, who was instructed by the prophet Samuel after they had won a battle that he was to wait until Samuel arrived before offering the sacrifice. But Samuel was supposed to arrive at a certain date, and he didn't arrive, and the people were getting restless because there was a battle yet to fight, and they needed to offer sacrifices, and Saul could not wait. And so finally, he went ahead of the Lord, and he offered the sacrifice, and that's when Samuel showed up, and he reprimanded him because he was not willing to wait for God's timing. He leapt ahead of him. You know, we're told in culture that Job was probably one of the most patient men who ever lived. You hear about the patience of Job, but his wife was not one of the most patient people who ever lived. She got tired of his suffering, and she wanted to rush things along and get ahead of God. So in Job 2, verse 9, it says, his wife said to him, "Are you still trying to maintain your integrity? Curse God and die. Let's just move this thing ahead and get it done with. You're going to die anyways. Curse him and die." So there was no patience there. I don't know if you've had a chance to hear the latest Tim Hawkins DVD, but he talks about Job and his wife, and I think, what great insight from this comedian. You know, he says, when God gave the devil permission to do anything to Job he wanted, you know, he eliminated Job's children. He killed Job's livestock. He destroyed Job's building. He burned down all of Job's property, but he left his wife alone. And he says, you know, that's saying something, isn't it? Some demons say, "Master, you didn't touch his wife." I know. Leave her alone. I know what I'm doing. She was not patient. It comes down to trusting God with His timing. One time when our children were young, we were trying to catch a flight at Logan Airport in Boston. We were flying back from visiting my family who live out west, or they did at the time. And I hate flying into Logan because the terminal that you come in from and the one we have to go to get up to Maine is so far apart. It's like a mile walk. And everything is always delayed there, and it's always late, and the weather's always an issue. And so our plane got in late. And this was in the day when, you didn't have those nice suitcases with rollers on them and the way they do now. So we had two heavy bags that we had to carry. And we had two little children that they were old enough to carry in our arms. And so I picked up David, our son, and Candace, our daughter, in my two arms. And Marcia picked up the suitcases, and we ran. It must have been for a mile from one end of the airport all the way to the other to try to get to that plane. And you know what that's like. You maybe have been in that situation, and the sweat is just pouring off of your brow. You're absolutely exhausted, and you're racing because you know you're going to miss that flight. You've only got a couple of minutes, and as we're running and trying to get the time is ticking away, and it's time to load, and eventually the flight we're going to miss the flight. And the problem with that is when you're flying into Presque Isle, there's only one flight that goes in there. So if you don't make that flight, you're not going to get there. So we are racing. We finally get to the gate, and then we discover that flight too was delayed. And so we got to get settled down and wipe the sweat off our brow and wait for another hour until eventually that flight took off. And there was a principle I learned from that. If God wants us on the next flight, then he'll delay the plane. It's simple, but if we are responsible, not intentionally being late and not caring, but if we are responsible and we still find the timing of our lives and events to be different than we would like them to be, it becomes an issue of trusting God with the timing, because God is in control. God is sovereign, and he knows what he's doing, and our lives are in his hand. Do I trust him with my life plan? Here's another cause of impatience. Another root issue is the desire for control. Sometimes people are impatient because they want to control others around them. They want everybody else to conform to their expectations. And sometimes it even takes the form of arrogance. My life is more important than yours. They'd never say it that way, but my life is more important than yours, and I need you to get out of my way or do whatever I need you to do so that I can do what I need to do, because what I need to do is more important than what you need to do. In May 2012, there was an article by Natasha Crane that tells the following story, and I think she captures this beautifully. She said, 2 weeks ago, I received a notice from the Department of Motor Vehicles, the DMV, that it was time to come in and renew my driver's license. Now, I don't know what the DMV is like in other parts of the country, but in Southern California, it is widely known to be a disaster, one that you don't set foot in without an appointment. I promptly made my appointment online and headed for the DMV one morning last week. As I expected, the walk-in line was out the door. Never mind those people, I thought to myself. I brushed by them with my best, quote, I have an appointment demeanor, clutching my confirmation in hand, only to see a marginally shorter line ahead labeled, appointments wait here. My sigh was loud enough to be heard in a 15 to 20 person radius. The line moved fairly quickly, but then there was only one person left ahead of me, and it stopped moving. For some reason, this person's transaction was taking almost 20 minutes. I stared at the back of his tattooed head, evaluating his low-hanging shorts and the big gold jewelry draped around his neck. Why can't this guy get his life together? Why can't he get his paperwork right? Why does this have to impact me right now? I broke. I marched up to the counter next to him and asked the worker if there was anyone else who could help me, because this appointment was taking a ridiculous amount of time. He shook his head and sent me back to wait. 2 minutes later, the person ahead of me was done. I felt a knot in my stomach as he turned around, not knowing what to expect after I'd been so rude. He nodded at me meekly and said kindly, "Thank you so much for your patience." Then he walked out the door. I felt 1 inch tall. Had I been him, I would have offered the impatient person behind me a few rude comments in return. Instead, the person I had judged to be somehow less important or worthy than myself responded with kindness and Christ-like humility. Fast forward 10 minutes. I had to stand in line again, this time to have my picture taken. As if I hadn't just experienced the sobering kindness of the gang member, I was already anxiously shifting back and forth, evaluating the group of 3 teenage boys in front of me. They were loud and obnoxious, and somehow I had concluded they didn't deserve to have their pictures taken first. Then one turned to me with a big smile. "Hey, why don't you go ahead of us? There are 3 of us and only one of you, so it's no problem if you go first." I felt God throwing cold water on my face at that moment, trying to wake me up from my coma of arrogance. Twice in the span of an hour, strangers had exhibited humble and kind behavior that I lacked. I don't know if any of them were Christians, but they acted as Christians, and I did not. When we're impatient with other people, we're saying that we are more important than they are, that our needs are more important than their needs, and that we need to control them to get in line with our needs and with our schedule. Philippians 2, verse 3 and 4 says, "With humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but for the interests of others." When getting irritated because someone or something is holding you up, ask yourself some questions. What am I really irritated about? Am I being realistic? Am I being flexible? Do I think my life is more important than theirs? Am I letting go of control? Whose control am I fighting, theirs or God's? Can I really do anything to change the situation? And if not, why stress? Have I prayed about this and entrusted the situation to God? You see, people who want to control other people miss the magic of the moment. Jesus was with his disciples, and they came to the home of his best friend Lazarus. They were going to spend the evening there. Lazarus had 2 sisters, Mary and Martha. And he was teaching. The Messiah was teaching in their home. And Mary, along with the other disciples, gathered around the feet of Jesus. I mean, who wouldn't? If the Messiah were in your home teaching, where would you be? You'd want to be listening to every word that came from his lips. But not Mary. Because Mary had, or not Martha rather, Martha had in her mind that I have guests in my home. And I need to make sure that I appropriately take care of them. And so she's racing around cooking and cleaning and adjusting and doing all kinds of things that she needs to do to make sure her guests are taken care of. And she peeks into the living room and she sees her sister Mary, who's sitting there with everybody else. And Mary's raptly paying attention to Jesus and not paying any attention to her. And you know what she's thinking. Well, what does she get to sit in there for? And I got to be out here doing all of this work. And she mulls that over in her mind. The more she works, the more angry she becomes that her sister's not in there helping her, because obviously this stuff has to get done, and it's all left to her. Who does Mary think she is, leaving this up to me? Am I suddenly the slave of the home? Am I the maid? Why does Mary get to do that, and I don't get to do that? And she can't take it anymore. She marches into the living room, interrupts Jesus, and says, "Master, I'm out here doing all of this work, and my sister Mary, she's not doing a thing. Talk to her and tell her to get in here to help me." And Jesus turns to her and he says, "Martha, Martha, you are so disturbed about so many things. Mary has chosen the better thing." And what he was saying is, you know what? You ought to do it too. Who really cares about taking care of dishes and food? Something far more important is happening here. You ought to be right here with your sister. But Martha missed that moment because she wanted to control her sister Mary. She was impatient because Mary wasn't doing what she felt Mary ought to be doing. She wasn't living in the moment. She missed an incredible, once in an eternity opportunity. Richard Rohr calls it the sacred, or the naked now. There's a naked now, a naked moment that you live in the midst of that. But I miss those moments when I want to control everybody around me, when I want to control everything around me, when I want to be in charge, when I want it my way, when there's a certain way I think things should be done, and they're not being done that way, and I want to use whatever influence I can to try to corral everybody around to do it the way that I think it ought to be done. And when we do that, we miss the naked now. And so what we have to do is repent and surrender control to God's timing, God's sovereignty, God's providence. Impatience, losing my cool. It's not a matter of having an anger problem. It's a matter of having a control problem. It's a matter of having a trust problem. Another way of saying it is that we need to learn to be still. The Psalms say it over and over again. Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." Or Psalm 37:7, "Be still in the presence of the Lord and wait patiently for him to act." Or Isaiah 40:31, "But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." There's a hymn that I want us to sing, and we've actually sung the tune already.